couple of years ago, while I was backpacking in Australia, I traveled around by driving a van like many other backpackers there did. It saved a lot of money on accommodations. Typically, I'd sleep in rest areas, gas stations, or wherever I could find a place to park. This one particular night, I'd been driving for quite a few hours and was starting to feel really sleepy. I decided to stop at the next rest area, which happened to be in the middle of nowhere. During the day, parking there might have been fine, but at night it felt like a scene out of a horror movie. There were no other cars parked there. I knew I should have kept going to find a more populated area, but my drowsiness was getting the best of me. There were also no lights whatsoever. I turned off the engine and closed the curtains of my van. It wasn't long before I was awoken by heavy knocking on the side of my van. The voice outside said, "Hey, open up." "It's the police." Nothing jolts you awake like that. My heart was racing immediately as I adjusted to the rush of adrenaline in my system. They repeated the knocking and the claim that they were the police. My first thought was that I had parked somewhere I shouldn't have. Then again, it was in the middle of nowhere, and it was a rest area. Even in my groggy state, something felt off about the situation. Instead of opening up right away, I decided to slowly move over to one of the windows and peek through a gap in the curtains. Outside, I could make out the shadowy shape of a man standing beside the van. His car wasn't too far away, but it didn't have any lights or official markings. It was clear to me that this guy was not a police officer. Summoning whatever courage I had left in that moment, I shouted, "Get away! I have a gun, and I'm calling the real cops on the radio." Of course, I didn't actually have a gun or a radio, but my bluff seemed to work. The man immediately sprinted back to his car. Adding to the eeriness, someone else emerged from the nearby bushes and joined him in the car. They left within a few minutes after I turned on my van and drove in the opposite direction they had gone. Safe to say, I never slept in another rest area that didn't have at least a couple of other cars parked around. I don't know what those guys wanted, but considering Australia's history of backpacker serial killers, I'm just grateful to be here today. This is a story that I was told by my mother when I was old enough to understand what almost happened. I was only a few weeks old when this occurred. In those days, when a mother had given birth and taken her baby home, midwives were sent from the hospital to check on the baby and mother, usually twice a week at most. My dad was working a lot at the time, so he wasn't home. My mother had put me to sleep and was going about her business in the house. She had already had 2 midwives come earlier that morning. Before I continue, she immediately knew that what happened next was not normal. She had a sudden knock at the door, and someone outside claimed to be the police. We lived in a fairly close-knit community, where there were rarely any threats to safety. Most of the people who lived nearby were young, healthy couples who were usually at work during the day. This meant that the area was fairly deserted at this time. My mother, thinking it was safe, opened the door. To her surprise, she was greeted by a man and a woman dressed in midwifery outfits with hospital badges and everything. They were very polite and asked if they could come inside. They explained that they had been sent by the hospital to check on her and the new baby. My mom let them in, as they appeared to have all the professional attire and badges. They even knew the exact time my mother had given birth, that she had a little girl and her name. These strangers seemed very convincing, and all the information they had was easily accessible in hindsight. My mother, understandably concerned, explained that 2 midwives had already visited earlier that week. She also told them that she was going to call the hospital to confirm their legitimacy. She had not been notified of any additional visits just a day or 2 later. She also warned them that her husband was on his way home from work and wouldn't be happy about this situation. At this point, the pair got defensive and insisted that they would leave. They were pushy about separating the baby from my mother. Finally, she managed to get them to go, and their behavior quickly shifted to calm and apologetic. They assured her that it must have been a mistake and suggested not bothering to check with the hospital. Despite their attempts to convince her otherwise, my mom continued trying to contact the hospital. What made things even stranger was that as my mom opened the door to make them leave, she noticed another person waiting in a car outside with the engine running. It's likely that this was the getaway driver. After they left, my mother was quite scared and immediately called the hospital. They confirmed that they hadn't sent any midwives to visit her. They explained that they would always inform the mother beforehand if they were sending someone, and that they would never request to separate the mother and baby. The hospital also mentioned that they didn't even have a male midwife on staff. My parents were advised to contact the police, which they did. The police took down a description of the individuals, but as far as I know, nothing significant came from it. It's unclear what those people were planning. The fact that they had access to all that personal information, including the exact time of my birth, and were willing to go to such lengths with fake uniforms and badges, is incredibly unsettling. Thank God my mother acted on her instinct and got them out of the house and stuck to her guns. It's even more creepy to imagine what my life would be now if they had gotten to carry out whatever they were planning. I don't believe it was a genuine mix-up. They didn't follow standard protocol and were very insistent on getting the two of us apart. I believe we were very lucky that day. Let me start off by saying I really like to explore old mines. It's kind of a thrill for me because I'm mildly claustrophobic. That sounds weird, I know. Why would someone explore an old mine if they're scared of enclosed places? The thing about it, though, is that it really gives you a kind of rush. When I was a kid, I got lost in a cave, you see. And although it did freak me out quite a bit, it also made me feel so alive. When I began to explore, I chose mines instead of caves because mines are harder to get lost in. Caves are a lot scarier in my mind. Generally, I just travel to the end of the available mine, my heart pounding in my chest the whole way. Then I try to get out as quickly as possible. Each and every time, I swore to myself I would never again go into another mine, but I'd always get the itch to go just once more, almost immediately after I'd left. I was going to explore a mine in West Virginia. I won't mention the name of it because technically I didn't have a legal right to be there. I actually even had to park my car on the side of the highway and walk there, which was a pretty big risk. There were no cars coming for a while, so I jumped the railing and the fence and made my way over toward that mine. I had done tons of research to try and find where this place was online, so I was able to figure it out pretty quickly. I knew this one was going to be a relatively straight trip from the entrance to the mine to the back. It was about 1,000 feet deep or so. There was a chance that by the time I got to the end, I wouldn't even be able to see the entrance anymore. My heart instantly began racing as I thought of that. Fortunately, although the mine was a bit damp, it wasn't very wet like some of the others I'd encountered, so I wouldn't be having too difficult a time. So there I was, entering the mine, and of course my heart started beating faster right away. I had to walk very slowly because I didn't want to get surprised and trip on anything. No one knew where I was, so if I got hurt, no one would be able to find me, and I'd have to get out of trouble myself. I made a habit of turning around every 50 feet or so to look around and make sure I could still see the entrance. Of course, it got smaller and smaller the further I went into the mine, and the more my heart thudded in my ears and my chest. When I'd gotten halfway deep into the mine, I thought I turned around and saw the entrance was now very, very far away. It was just barely visible. The mine was so dark too. I had a small flashlight with me to see where I was going, but I didn't want to use it until I absolutely had to. As I mentioned before, the only reason I did this in the first place was because I so enjoyed the thrill of being scared, and the flashlight would have kept me from being so. As I descended further into this mine, I thought I heard a sudden sound. It sounded a bit like a giggle or something. I immediately stopped in my tracks and tried to listen a bit closer. After a few moments of nothing though, I decided it must have just been in my head. I began to walk a bit further, about 700 feet into the mine. I heard that same giggle once more. I again stopped, this time feeling my heartbeat leap into my throat. I turned around and looked at how deep I was in. I considered going back for a moment, but I figured this must just be in my imagination. Who the hell would be down here other than me? I wanted to make it as far in as I could go, so I kept on walking. When I got closer to the end of the mine, I heard that giggle again. Only thing was, this particular time, I was absolutely sure I just heard it close by too. It was not my imagination this time. It didn't stop either. It was coming from right behind me. I fumbled in my pocket and pulled out my flashlight. I flipped it on, turning around. Sitting right in front of me were two little girls holding their hands over their mouths while they were laughing. They looked at me, and in the darkness, their eyes looked completely black. One of the girls took her hand away from her mouth for a moment and pointed behind me, further into the mine. I dropped my flashlight in surprise. It broke on the rocks, but I didn't care about that right then. The laughing didn't stop, even though I couldn't see either of them anymore. Immediately, I began to sprint my way back out of the mine. The giggling didn't seem to get any quieter, though. Actually, I thought those girls must be following me. It remained almost completely dark until I was almost back to the entrance of the cave. I didn't dare to look back. I hopped out of that mine and ran to my car, which fortunately was right where I had left it. That was not my last time in an abandoned mine, but I can tell you it was the last time I ever went to that one.